Hi, I'm here with FiiO's FA7 IEMs. These are their latest $300 IEMs, and they use quad balanced armatures, and they're at the same price as the good old FH5, which I also have here. And it's interesting because they have two pairs of IEMs with a slightly different presentation and slightly different setup. And you know, you have a bit of variety, and that's where things can get a little bit complex, is which one do you choose? So one of the main things about the FH5, just getting into the ergonomics, they come with much the same kind of setup. You know, the cable is same. If you want to check out the unboxing, I'll put a link up in the corner. You can check that out. Some people don't like to see already know what's in the box, and they can see that, don't need to see that. So I'm just going to get into the ergonomics and sound. So one thing about hybrid IEMs we remember is that they have to fit both a dynamic driver and balanced armature drivers in the same case. So they end up being quite chunky, as these turned out to be. You know, once you get those three nozzles in there, this is actually quite 6 millimeters wide, this nozzle, and it's about 5 millimeters tall. Now 6 millimeters is very large, so it's got to have ports for all the different sets of drivers in there. And in doing so, it made getting some tips on very difficult, as we saw in the review of this. And if you haven't already checked it, check out the description. I'll put the link to the review of the FH5 in there if you haven't already seen it. And so in the same box, you have pretty much the same tips in the FA7, except they included biflange tips. And that's been quite interesting and quite weird in some ways. Now, in not having a dynamic driver in there, you can actually, it's kind of a little bit difficult to see on camera. But you see there's a scoop out where my thumb is. Well, that scoop out is kind of convex on the FH5, so sometimes getting good insertion in your ears could be a little bit trickier with these, whereas with the FA7 it's a little bit easier. This one is a little bit more closer to 6 millimeters tall and 5 millimeters wide in terms, so tips just go on easily, whereas tips are troublesome with the FH5. Interestingly enough, I saw that SpinFit have 5.5 millimeter wide tips, which might fit these better. So I haven't got a set of those yet, so I'm going to have to try them down in the future. But anyhow, with that less bulk in there, like these have, these are easier, at least for me, easier to get in your ear. And unlike the metal shell of these are 3D printed medical grade plastic, so they do feel nice, even just holding them nice and smooth and pleasant. And you know, they have the good. I chose the good old red and blue option. I don't think most people will be choosing this, but I chose it because when you're reviewing stuff and switching stuff in and out, it's faster just to grab stuff that's very obviously left or right than it is anything else. And they look shiny. But anyhow, so that leaves us with the sound. Now, the FH7 has a fairly flat or fairly neutral tuning, maybe on the slight warm side of neutral. So that's a little bit more towards what I'd call a consumer tuning, though there's some caveats in there. I mean, the thing probably it's easiest to compare to is the FH5, because then it's easier to talk about the different characteristics. The FH5, if you remember, had a kind of a U-shaped tuning, but if we look at the treble on both of them, the treble is kind of about equal. It's not as good as some of the more high-end IEMs I have here, obviously, but still it has no particular harshness or unpleasantness that I don't like. I mean, it's not, given that I am spoilt by high-end IEMs, the treble obviously doesn't sound quite as nice, but sounds, it's decent, it's very easy to listen with. And the upper mid-range is somewhat similar in both of them, maybe with, of course, the FH5, due to their slightly U-shaped sound, the upper mid-range comes through more strongly. And it's where the base where things differentiate more. So you have in here the dynamic driver, and the FA7s you have balanced armature driver. So the result is that the FA7s have a kind of thicker, more kind of regular bass focus. Like most bass we listen to is kind of mid bass. Actually, low bass we don't have as much of. Whereas the FH5 is kind of got a very low bass rumble focus, and the kind of mid bass is kind of not so strong, which means, as I said, the upper mids tend to come out more. So that means, say, with vocals in the FA7s, they come through with more body, and it feels like you have more of a vocal or instrument focus. There's kind of more meat in the sound. It's kind of a thicker, heavier sound with the FA7s, but it doesn't have quite the low bass punch of the FH5s. When there's some rumble or percussion or whatever at the beginning of tracks, my good old Arlington by the Wailing Jennies, one of my favorite tracks. Maybe the drums come through a bit better with the dynamic driver FH5s, but they come through sufficiently in the FA7s. And it's if you don't listen to these, if you just listen to the FA7s, it sounds very sufficient and very good. It's only if you do things like compare And I've always said comparisons are evil, because then you start finding what you don't like about something when you compare it to something else. That's where, the dynamic driver comes through, doing a bit of a better job. But the overall balance, I mean, I think the FA7s give a better overall balance to the music, and make it, most stuff, more listenable. With the slight sacrifice, you don't get quite the punch of the FH5's dynamic driver. So, for example, where this works better is in a wider variety of music, say like older pop music. There's a lot of stuff out there, ranging even to older metal, like some Soundgarden tracks seem to be mastered with not quite enough bass. Old pop seemed not to have a great deal of bass either. Maybe that was something to do with a lot of stuff being mastered on record. We're having too much bass, but records by themselves are mastered with a deliberate lack of bass to stop the needle jumping, in the grooves. And I don't know if that's how much it's related to that, or how much it's related to speakers used in the studio. But that kind of music where, for example, the Youngbloods, just off the top of my head, that works better with the FA7s, because it fills out that mid bass. Now, the downside of that is more modern music, which has a lot more bass, like Melody Gardot. I was listening to one of her not so popular albums, but actually really good albums, called The Currency of Man. I mean, that's a kind of mixture of jazz and pop, but it's mastered more like pop. And that is where things can start to sound too thick with these stock tips. So it's an interesting thing when you get into the tips that came with the FA7s, as they tend to make the bass sound a bit too thick. Now, it's odd that they included, this variety of tips, as we saw before. They had the vocal tips, we have the bass tips, and that worked with the FH5. And it worked with the FH5 because the dynamic drivers, you can adjust the bass by adjusting the nozzle size, but you can't do that so much with balanced armature drivers. I mean, you can do a little bit. I mean, you can adjust the treble a little bit in some regards, depending on which tips you put on. But if you take these standard tips off and you put on what they call the vocal tips, that seems to drop the mid bass kind of just enough to kind of remove some of that thickness and some of that bass interfering into the mid range. Likewise, the tips they call the bass tips don't really enhance the bass. I mean, they seem to have very slightly different presentation. What I really liked, actually, the biflange tips which they included worked really well, as did the foam tips. So it's kind of these stock tips that they put on there, which maybe just thicken up cause the mid bass to be a little bit too thick to really be ideal. But as I said, if you're listening to old pop, you probably wouldn't notice. But if you're listening to more modern music, you probably would notice quite a bit. So that I listened to a lot of my usual stuff, my usual bass tests, like Massive Attack Angel, the New Basement tapes. Then you have Sophie Tucker and all that. I think the bass is still pretty punchy and still pretty good with these all the same, given that you don't have a dynamic driver. It's only, again, if you listen to IEMs with a dynamic driver, you notice the difference. The other thing is, of course, with that U-shaped presentation of the FH5s, it gives a, well, albeit artificial, sense of space to the music, because if the thicker the mid-range, the lower mids are, and the thicker the mid-bass is, the narrower the kind of soundstage you perceive to some degree. And that's why I think there's kind of I guess that's something to do also with the Harman target curve, but that's probably another discussion, a bit above my proverbial pay grade in that one. But the FH5 tend to give a sense of space to the music, whereas the FA7s tend to sound more closed in and boxy. I mean, kind of the high-end equivalent would be, Campfire Audio's Solaris versus like the Atlas. The Atlas was kind of really bass-heavy and kind of sound more narrow and closed in. Whereas kind of like where you have that lower mid, that standard mid-bass, again, is not quite so strong, then it gives you more of a sense of space. But in I found the FA7s were really pleasant to listen to with vocals. A lot of vocal tracks I have were really enjoyable with these. Whereas some stuff, maybe something like Fleetwood Mac tends to sound, maybe to some people might sound a little bit thin on something like the FH5. So you have that really punchy bass here versus having that kind of more all-round agreeable sound with the FA7s. So it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen the other with some music. Which presentation did I like? And I went back and forth and I thought, I like this music better with these IMs or whatever. And then I tried listening again and I thought, well, in comparison, depending which one pair I started with, it was kind of an even draw on that. So it kind of came down to that more even presentation, more good all-rounders versus kind of more entertaining presentation. Still good all-rounders, but more kind of low bass punch. So I tried also scaling them. I plugged them into FiiO's good old M9, and that worked really well. As I only had single-ended input, but that was sufficient. I mean, they don't require a lot of drive to get going. Of course, they're only balanced armature IEMs. You know, low output impedance is most ideal, considering they have a crossover in there, and they may not have a flat impedance curve. And I plugged them also into, kind of disproportionately expensive Acetalone AK380, and they did improve. There was a noticeable improvement there, so they do scale up a bit. So it's probably worth, if you do have a slightly more expensive DAP, maybe, I don't know maybe I wouldn't be interested to try something like a FiiO FA7 Mark II. Maybe they probably scale up to that pretty reasonably. Beyond that, I don't really know. Probably maybe not so much. So which do you get? Now, I don't think either of those is a particularly bad buy, as both were pretty good all-rounders with most kinds of music. I think, it's kind of, do you pick one or the other? I think if you have trouble getting fit, like you have smaller ears and you might have more trouble with the FH5s, obviously the FA7s are going to be better fit, with their better ergonomics and a slightly more ergonomic design, getting a slightly deeper seal. At least for me, with kind of very average ears, I felt like I got a slightly better seal with the FA7s. And then on the other hand, if you like your big bass punch, you might want the FH5. So it was is pretty close in kind of deciding, but I hope that gave you some idea of kind of how they sound. And if you're lost as to which one to buy and you want me to say this is definitely better or that is definitely better, well, that's a tough call. As it goes, if I haven't given you a definitive answer, sorry, because both are, I think, equally good in their own ways. But all the same, that's my overview of the FA7s. And so maybe hopefully I'll get some more IEMs around this price range to compare in the future. But otherwise, I hoped that my review of them was useful. And again, if you have any questions or comments or criticisms, constructive criticism I really welcome. I had some good feedback from people in the comments in the past. Please do post them. And again, thank you to my supporters who have supported me throughout the last year. It's because of them that I'm able to make more of these videos and be making many more this year. Do consider check the links in the description for ways to support me. And it could be just if you're interested in buying either of these, try the Amazon link in the description. That will help me out. If you're interested in buying me a cup of coffee, there is a link to how you can support me in doing that. Equivalent to buying me a cup of coffee once in a while. That will really help out, and you actually get to see these reviews in advance without ads if you do support me. So, thanks once again everyone for watching, and I'll see you online.